sneaky, spying podcasts. Hi, I'm Ken Ray, welcoming you to episode 198 of The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. You may think of podcasts as kind of one way. Podcasters talk, listeners listen. That's the exchange. But there are podcasts out there that are listening as well. Well, not so much listening as siphoning off listener data, with listeners none the wiser. We'll see if we can change that today with the feeds. Rob Walch. Don't touch that podcast app. This is Checklist 198, brought to you by Secure Mac. I started podcasting a little over 15 years ago, but it was just this week that I found out that some podcasts actually track their listeners. Good news. No show that I'm associated with, including this one, pulls anything that shady. But a lot of shows do. Rob Walch is VP of Podcaster Relations at Libsyn. He's also co-host of The Feed with Elsie Escobar and host of Today in iOS. And he joins us to talk about the tracking. So a piece that you wrote about a year and a half ago begins, "There is no opt-in for podcast listeners when it comes to tracking." Now, before another conversation that you and I had earlier this week, I'd have said, well, there's no reason for there to be an opt-in for podcast tracking. But you say that podcasts can be used to track listeners and their personal data.
Yeah, it's scary. Most people think because nowadays, you go to all these websites and there's places where you have to opt into this or opt into that, opt out of this, that since you don't have to do any of that with podcasting, no one's tracking you. Mm-hmm. And nothing could be further from the truth. A lot of shows are starting to track now. And it's really unethical, immoral, and in some countries illegal. And they block it in the countries where it's illegal to track without the opt-in. So a lot of these services track you in the U.S., but the same service, they say, oh, we're GDPR compliant, which means they just block their service from working in Europe, which isn't compliant. It's just avoidant. And sadly, that it's getting worse.
I want to get into how they might be tracking you. I mean, my first thought was this would have to do with the podcast aggregator. So, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Downcast, Overcast, iHeartRadio. I feel certain there are at least 5 more with the word cast in them somewhere. And then I thought maybe it had to do with location services. I even went into my privacy settings in iOS to see whether any of the many podcast apps that I have on my phone was accessing my location. Either they're not doing that or they're doing it on the sly. I'm assuming, though, that has nothing to do with location services. And you told me earlier this week it has nothing to do with the aggregator either.
Right. It's not the aggregator app. It's nothing to do with Apple Podcasts app. You can have all the privacy settings set that you want. And what happens is they fire a tracking pixel at you. And the aggregator app has no control of this. It's not the aggregator app that's doing it. It is actually from the host where the media files are hosted. And don't worry, folks, it's not happening with the show. But what happens is this tracking pixel gets sent out, and then they collect data. So now this third party is collecting data on you.
All right, wait, hold on. I'm sorry. Before you go any further, when you say tracking pixel, are we using that colloquially? Because I think of a tracking pixel as being something associated with the screen.
Yeah, and this is what it really means is they're sending 1 byte of data out. Okay. To the server to be delivered so that your IP address information, user agent information gets bounced back to them. And now what happens is in a database somewhere, your IP address and your user agent and then the file that you requested all get put into a database and stored. So now if you're listening to a podcast on mental health issues, you are now in a database with that information that you just listened to an episode or started to listen to an episode from that podcast.
Which is not a big deal if you listen to one episode. The illustration that you gave me in another conversation we had earlier this week is if you're listening to 5. Or if you're listening to, on cannabis legalization, let's say, or, it's like all the data that we talk about. I mean, a lot on the checklist. The one tiny little piece of data, unless it's your social security number or your credit card number, the one tiny piece of data may not mean that much, but, that piece of data plus that piece of data plus that piece of data starts to lead to a profile.
Correct. And that's the issue. You're getting profiled on information you had no idea you were getting profiled on. No way to opt in or opt out. And really no idea it ever happened. So now you listen to 5 podcasts on, mental health issues, and some database now says this person has a mental health issue. And then you go to apply for a pilot at a major airline, and they run an AI background check on you, and you don't get hired, and you wonder what happened. Or it could be anything. This is just some random examples. But the point of this is, at least with the websites, you can choose what, when, and where you're getting tracked. And that's fine. And I have no problem with people getting tracked if they opt into it, right? They chose to be opted in. Apple has the same philosophy, right? With iOS 14 when it comes out. It's you get to opt into where you're being tracked as the way it should be. But sadly in podcasting, some companies, not all, but some companies are now tracking people when they never had that chance to opt in.
Let me ask you a question really quickly. You and I talk about profiles and data building profiles. I mean, are we to assume that XYZ podcast production house or ad firm tied to podcast production house is actually building a profile, or is the concern just, well, now they've gathered information and that information could end up in the wrong hands, or, when it's time to make a buck, they take all the information they have and they sell it on to someone else?
The individual podcaster, it's not that. It's not who you're worried about. It's more the third-party ad networks that they're sharing and allowing the data to be shared with, and put that tracking pixel in there. And when they build up a big database of information, that database becomes valuable. And valuable databases have one of two things or both happen to them. They get sold, they get hacked. Mm-hmm. You can ask, was it Experian? Whoever it was, right?
It was Equifax. I remember Equifax, because I had a cute little name for them after that happened.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that's supposed to be like the most secure, and that got hacked. So when someone says, oh, well, we're not going to get hacked. If you have a valuable database, you're either going to sell it or be hacked, or both.
It's about time, too, I think, that we start worrying about other people. I'm sorry. I mean, maybe you think it's had nothing to do with me because I'm living my life on the up and up. I'm free and clean. I'm not doing anything that anybody's going to question. I mean, first of all, things that weren't questionable 5 years ago suddenly are, and who knows what will be again in 5 years. The other thing, though, is even if you're living your life, in a way that you think is perfectly whatever, if you have a friend or family member or a coworker or anybody and they have a life outside of anything that you know, I mean, this is all stuff that could affect, even if you think there's no way it can affect you, it can affect someone you know. So that's just my little soapbox moment. Now, I got to ask you, in the piece that you wrote, and we'll have a link to the piece that you wrote in the show notes for this week's show, you got some quotes in there, though they're not attributed to anyone real. You use code names for either the people or the companies. I do need to ask before we get into them, are they quotes? Or were you paraphrasing things that you've read, heard, or been told firsthand?
They are quotes.
Okay. All right. So let's go through a few of these quotes then. First from Mr. Blue. And if you're a Tarantino fan, you'll know what we're doing. First from Mr. Blue. When our tag fires, we are hoping to get the listener IP address as well as the listener user agent. We use the IP address to match to our U.S. residential device graph in order to match the exposure to a conversion coming through via a pixel or third-party data. Natural persons may be associated with online identifiers provided by their devices, applications, tools, and protocols, such as Internet Protocol or IP address, cookie identifiers, or other identifiers. That's just a lot of gobbledygook that I don't understand, to be honest with you. When we say user agent, first of all, what are we talking about?
The device and the application on that device.
Okay.
So it could be, Overcast version such and such, and for iOS on an iPhone. It's whatever the application was and the information about that application and device that requested the file.
When we're saying natural persons may be associated with online identifiers, yada, 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 that's specifically me, right? I mean, that's specifically, this is not the anonymized data sent back and hashed and all that stuff. That is specifically Rob Walch was listening to this, or if not Rob Walch, owner of the iPhone with this UDID and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, this one goes as blatantly as you possibly can to say we violate GDPR and CCPA. Some people don't like GDPR, but the reality was GDPR was created for privacy reasons. The internet was getting out of hand. And CCPA is a little bit watered down and a little bit tougher depending on which part of it you're looking at. But in any case, what they're doing is not allowed in California and is not allowed in Europe. And illegal in Brazil, illegal in South Africa, and a few other states will soon have laws in place that'll be illegal there as well. Whether they continue to track you or not in those states or places, who knows?
Because this sounds like a thing that, I mean, even though you wrote an article about it about a year and a half ago, this sounds like a thing that most people don't know is happening.
Right. Because there hasn't been a way, and we'll get into why now this article is finally going to see some light. There's some tools coming out that are going to help the listeners.
Right.
We'll get into that.
Let's do another quote. This one is from Mr. Brown. A site hosted actually by Mr. Brown says, we collect behavioral and performance metrics that podcasters and advertisers need to make informed decisions. The company gives you unprecedented detailed audience data, including who, what, when, where, and how they're listening to your podcast. Get an unfair advantage with the ultimate in podcast analytics. Data can be a beautiful thing. That sounds brazen. I mean, is that like marketing speak and it's really not that granular, or is it really that granular?
Scary is it's more on the really that granular side. And, you know, in my article, I at that point, I broke out what Wikipedia defines as stalking. And I said,
right.
Stalking, not really a beautiful thing. There's nothing beautiful about letting your listeners be stalked. That was how I kind of summed it up there.
Mr. Blonde is next. The company is committed to consumer privacy, making consumers aware of how their data is being used and providing the ability to opt out of targeted advertising. Consumers will receive notice and have the ability to opt out of targeted advertising via a link included in the descriptions of podcasts the user downloads. Two things. I mean, first of all, it sounds like that's saying that is a link to terms and conditions that you don't actually have to even acknowledge, let alone agree or disagree. That's just buried in the notes of a podcast. Am I reading that right?
Yeah. Yeah,
okay.
You are.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it sounds pretty bad.
Well, it doesn't sound great because I don't check the notes of every podcast that I listen to. Some of them I do because, some of them I do, but I don't read like all the way through. Like, here's the thing with Alec Baldwin. Some weeks he's talking to an economist. I don't care. Other weeks he's talking to Mickey Dolenz. And I say, yes, I want to listen to that, but I'm not reading all of the notes. I just know that I want to hear Mickey Dolenz or, Stanley Tucci.
Let's put it this way. When they talk about the notes, they're not talking about the show notes on the website. They're talking about the show notes embedded in the ID3 tags of the MP3 file.
What?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. So...
Yeah.
So basically they're saying that they have hidden the notes like under the seat of the thing that you're driving around in, but you have to know that they're there first of all, and then you have to be... I don't even know... I would have to download that to my computer to access the ID3 tags, wouldn't I?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, that's happening. That's happening all the time. You see people doing that all the time, Rob. Mm-hmm. Now, this actually did raise another question for me because it says that it's happening with downloaded files. I download no podcasts at this point. I listen to a number of podcasts, but to save space on my devices, I stream them rather than downloading them.
Technically, it's still a download. It's called a progressive download. Okay. Everything in podcasting is a download. It's either a full download, i.e. I hit the download button, the whole file drops down, or you hit play on a player and it starts to progressively download into the buffer of your device. In either case, they're downloads.
Okay, because that's what I was wondering. Like, is the pixel or the one bit of data Like if I'm streaming, am I avoiding that? But it sounds like the answer is no. I'm just getting it. Well, who knows when I'm getting it, but it happens and it's gone. And still, I'm saving space on my device. So, yay.
Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
Right.
We'll go with that.
All right, fine. Finally, Mr. Pink says this company's analytics is the first product to connect podcast downloads with on-site activity. We do this by determining who downloads via an RSS integration and matching them with on-site activity via JavaScript integration. Again, I need help with a couple of the terms, particularly the term on-site activity.
So on-site activity means something you did on the site of an advertiser that you heard from. So what they're doing here is they're sending the information of that you listen to XYZ podcast, and here's your user agent information, here's your IP address, and go store this over here on third party's site. And now let's look at everybody that goes to the site. Now, does anybody that go to the site have the same IP address? Oh, okay. Well, let's see. Did the IP address and the user agent match up? Well, then that person that listened to that also was a person that went to your website. What did they do with the website? So there's a lot of sharing of data here for you, the listener, to centralized databases and then comparing what happens at different websites to see if you did actions at those sites and what actions you did.
That's one of those things. I mean, this is like the whole, I've called this out a number of times, right around the time that the whole PRISM thing broke. Then President Obama came out and said, listen, we're not collecting data, we're just collecting metadata, right? I mean, this sounds like that. This is basically, they may not be able to identify me until, I feel like I'm a jigsaw puzzle piece, right? And so they've got okay, we know we sent this bit of information out. We know we've got this information on the site. We know somebody is active on the site. And now we can sort of like look at the contours of that. And there I am.
Here's the scary thing about this. The advertising agencies and the ad networks that are pushing all this, they're not really explaining to the podcasters what's happening to their listeners. So when you talk to the individual podcasters, you go, do you know what's happening with your listeners? Most of them have no idea. They go, oh, no, they just said they're going to get attribution of my listeners. Attribution of your listeners means stalking of your listeners. The tracking means stalking. And they don't explain that. They don't explain it to the brands. They don't say to the brand, they basically what they say to the brands is this: hey, we have a way to get a little bit more data using these techniques about who's listening to the podcast and if they are buying your product. And that's all they say. They don't go, we have this extra data because, well, we're tracking the people and they didn't opt in. So, oh, by the way, those people, those are your potential customers. So, yeah, you don't mind that we violate their privacy, do you? When brands are presented it that way, they tend to have a different reaction than, oh, that sounds good. Look what happened with Facebook with some big brand advertisers when the privacy issues hit the fan.
Everything we've heard from Rob so far is the bad news. We'll get to the good news in a moment, but first a word about MacScan 3 from Secure Mac. Chances are you're doing more with your computer today than you were a few months ago, thanks to all the staying in and social distancing. It's not that you're doing anything more risky with your computer, but with us relying on our computers so much more these days, it would be terrible for anything to happen to them. Actually, any time is a bad time for anything to happen, which is why you need a good anti-malware solution like MacScan 3. MacScan 3 is a great defense against malicious software attacks aimed at your Mac. It's developed by Secure Mac, trusted names in computer security and developers of exceptional security software for the Mac for over 20 years. MacScan 3 detects and removes Mac malware, catches keyloggers, removes tracking cookies, and provides full range or targeted scanning, all without crowding up your hard drive or slowing down your machine. Sign up for a free 30-day trial today at securemac.com/MacScan. Then once you decide to buy for less. You can take a little off your subscription to MacScan 3 with offer code CHECKLIST. Try it first, Watch it kick those tracking cookies to the curb. Then when you're ready to buy for less with offer code checklist at securemac.com/MacScan. Now more with Today in iOS host Rob Walch. So listeners to this show know that we don't like to present problems without also letting you know what you can do to mitigate those problems. The first thing on this one, I would guess, is just be aware. I was telling you, Rob, earlier this week that I remember getting an ad in one of the podcasts that I used to listen to that was targeted to my town. Now, you've actually done some checking on that one, and we'll come back to that in a bit. Mm-hmm. Obviously, though, I should have known then that it wasn't just I'm downloading an audio file and that's it. More information is exchanging or being exchanged here than just the hosts are saying things and I'm hearing what the hosts are saying. So again, I mean, the first thing that I would say, one of the biggest reasons that we're doing this show today, be aware that this is a thing. Listen to the ads, at least close enough and long enough to know whether, the ad you're hearing is content-based or, aimed directly, specifically at you. Although I don't know, honestly, if you could tell. I mean, I know, well, whatever. I mean, I know from my other show, from macOS Ken, I mean, I deal with salespeople. They give me something. No information is known about my listeners, except these are listeners who are interested in this kind of thing. That being, they're listening to a show about Apple News. And so there's certain demographic stuff that you can assume. But I mean, there's no tracking or anything like that going on. So I think you can probably hear, that very basic way. And then I want to come back to the one I was talking about earlier, though, because you say there's no tracking there. That confuses me a bit. But really quickly, let's talk about some other things people can do. Another thing you can do, well, right now what you can do is wait. But Rob said earlier that there is a tool coming. And why don't you let people know a bit more about that?
The next version of Overcast from Marco Arment, that update will have the ability for you to go in the directory and just search any podcast, and there'll be a little button underneath the name of the podcast that'll either say privacy or it'll say privacy and tracking, and you tap on it, and it'll let you know where the podcast is hosted, what's going on with it. So like what I mentioned earlier in one of the mental health ones, Amani's State of Mind is the name of the podcast. And what it says is there's DAI tracking and host and going on. So there's DAI is dynamic ad insertion, and then tracking, which is sharing and stalking of your listeners. So that's going on for this podcast, which happens to be about mental health issues, and it's hosted on Omni, and data is also being collected by Triton Digital. So yeah, definitely a podcast. If I was someone that was interested in or having some tough times and was looking for a podcast to help me on mental health, I'd skip that one. Quickly, right? I'd be like, nope, I don't want that tracking going on. So it makes it really easy to see, and Marco labels them with a little yellow triangle, and it's more about the tracking you have to worry about than the DII. The DII, again, dynamic ad insertion, is not inherently bad. What you had, the podcast you had me look up, that's all they had was the DII, not the tracking. And that was more geolocation, and that geolocation information is in your IP address when it goes to the host when they request it. So they're not sharing of data. As long as they're doing the insertion themselves on their own tools and they're not sharing it into a database, then you're fine. It's when the data gets shared without your knowledge is where it's an issue. But local ads can be beneficial if done right. And some people, comedians have been using them to promote upcoming events to the different areas where they're going to be, and other people use it, to back in the days when people had live events, and other people, did it for webinars and other things that were in the cities. Those applications are a little down these days. So, how important is this to you? Are you going to say everyone should listen to Overcast and nothing else? That's the only application I will recommend once Marco updates it. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Any idea about how long that's going to be? It's in beta right now. So there was a couple little bugs. I reported one to him. Okay. I'm on test flight. added me for that. So I guess once he gets all the bugs done and then does the update, my guess is he's probably waiting to release it around the release of iOS 14, but I don't know. I didn't ask him.
So let's say we've got that app. Now we're running our podcast through it. In fact, let me ask you that really quickly, because I think you said this a moment ago, but I want to double check. I'm thinking about downloading a podcast. I haven't started listening to it yet. You're saying that he's going to be able to tell before I start downloading it what it's doing?
Yes.
Okay. And again, I mean, basically, he's setting up an opt-in. I mean, if you absolutely need to hear Mondo Comedian Joke Fest, whatever podcast, and that guy is doing all of that tracking, Marco's not cutting people off from it. Overcast is not cutting people off from it. Overcast is just throwing up a couple of flags saying, hey, by the way, if you download this, this could happen and this could happen too.
And, if that's not your app of choice and you have all your subscriptions in another app, you can still get Overcast just to check out the podcast you already subscribed to.
Yeah.
And use it as a reference. But that said, you might as well listen where you're going to do the work to check out new podcasts. You might as well listen right there. Yeah. So when you find one, you can label it. Now, it'd be great if you added a feature in there where once you find one that has a privacy issue, you can flag it and it no longer ever shows up again in your search results.
Yeah, but then that's a thing. I mean, at that point, he's becoming the gatekeeper as opposed to the guy going, hey, keep an eye on that guy. Yeah. Speaking of which, so now we've checked out a podcast and we see some flags that we don't like. I'm guessing our choices are stop listening to that show if we want to. If we really want to keep listening to that show, get in touch with the show's producers and say, hey, what the heck's going on? Or just raise awareness outside of that. I mean, what would your suggestions be? Yeah,
I mean, the last two. My first recommendation is if you see this is going on and it's a podcast you're already listening to, reach out to the host. Say, hey, I don't know if you know this is going on, but I saw in Overcast that you guys are tracking me, and are you aware of this? And see what they have to say. Now, some of them will come back, oh no, our network told us that's not to worry about it. Yeah. To that point, you have to determine, did the person are they telling you the truth, or were they told the truth? The reality is, if it says it's tracking, the chances are you're being tracked. Then if you really like the show and you want to continue, you can maybe get some other listeners of the show together and tell the host that we don't like this, change it. And then finally, then the last option is to stop listening. Now, if you have never listened to the podcast and you see one that has tracking, you've never listened, just go find one that doesn't.
The one thing that I hate is this is a bad time to mess with people's money.
Well, here's the thing.
Yeah.
They're shooting themselves in the foot by doing this tracking, because the reason advertising is so effective in podcasting is trust between the podcasters and the listeners.
Yeah.
And what this is doing is this is eroding and breaking down that trust. It's not Marco breaking down that trust. Marco's shedding a light on the fact of these activities that are going on. It's not me that's causing issues. Writing this article a year and a half ago I was warning that, hey, this is going to break down trust between podcasters and listeners. That's going to hurt this space more than anything else. So if you want to talk about messing with people's money, the folks that are doing this tracking are the ones messing with the money, because they're messing with the trust that podcasters have with their listeners. And you look at the people that are pissed off at Facebook, right? Ask how much they love Facebook, right? And you get some people that are like, oh, I hate it. I'm only on it because I have to be on it. Well, they don't have to listen to your podcast. And there's other podcasts that aren't doing tracking, and they have an option.
I mentioned Rob's shows earlier, but let me remind you one more time. He co-hosts The Feed with Elsie Escobar. That's a podcast about podcasting, everything from the business side to keeping on. And then on his own, Rob hosts Today in iOS. You can guess what that one's about. Both of those shows are available wherever you get podcasts. And you can also keep up with Rob on Twitter at Podcast411. That's PODCAST 411 at Podcast 411 on Twitter. And thanks again to Rob Walch for joining us today. Hey, if you're looking for more security news and how-tos, the place to look is securemac.com/checklist. There you'll find notes for this show, for the last show we did, all the way back to the very first episode of the checklist. And you can listen right there as well. It all starts in one place, securemac.com/checklist. If you have a question you would like to ask or a topic you would like to hear us hit, our email address is checklist@securemac.com. That address again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, please do remember this. You're listening to The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. And we'll talk to you next week.